This episode is part 2 of a 2-part series, so if you haven't listened to the first video about Carl Jung, psychology, and alchemy, I recommend you do so. There will be a link in the description and up on the screen. Today we are continuing our analysis of Carl Jung, psychology, and alchemy, and we're going to jump right in with a passage from Jung. This is the beginning of the chapter entitled The Lapis Christ Parallel. Quote, "The examples given in the last chapter show that there is a spirit hidden in the prima materia, just as there was in the Nile stones of Osthenes. This spirit was eventually interpreted as the Holy Ghost in accordance with the ancient tradition of the nous, swallowed up by the darkness while in the embrace of physis. With this difference, however, that it is not the supreme feminine principle, earth, who is the devourer, but nous in the form of Mercurius or the tail-eating Ouroboros. In other words, the devourer is a sort of material earth spirit, an hermaphrodite possessing a masculine spiritual and feminine corporeal aspect. The original Gnostic myth has undergone a strange transformation. Nous and physis are indistinguishably one in the prima materia and have become a natura abscondita. The psychological equivalent of this theme is the projection of a highly fascinating unconscious content which, like all such contents, exhibits a numinous divine or sacred quality. Alchemy set itself the task of acquiring this treasure hard to attain and of producing it in visible form, as the physical gold, or the panacea, or the transforming tincture, insofar as the art still busied itself in the laboratory. But since the practical chemical work was never quite free from the unconscious contents of the operator, which found expression in it, it was at the same time a psychic activity, which can best be compared with what we called active imagination. This method enables us to get a grasp of contents that also find expression in dream life. The process is, in both cases, an irrigation of the conscious mind by the unconscious, and it is related so closely to the world of alchemical ideas that we are probably justified in assuming that alchemy deals with the same or very similar processes as those involved in active imagination and in dreams, i.e., ultimately with the process of individuation." End quote. So I wanted to start here because the quote-unquote explanation that Jung gives at the beginning of this chapter would probably be indecipherable nonsense to almost everyone who hadn't already become familiar with all of the concepts that we discussed in the previous episode. And it would seem like Jung is explaining the obscure by the more obscure, as the alchemists' watchword would have had it. And yet, if we bring to mind the main points that we've already considered, I think the passage is fairly easy to break down. Alchemy, in its essence, is the attempt to effect this mysterious union of the corporeal and the spirit. The corporeal meaning here the material world, the world of matter, of bodies, of flesh, and of earth. And it carries with it those feminine associations that we find equally so in both the philosophy of the Western and Eastern worlds, but the associations with earth and water, the material basis for all physical life, the chthonic, this is always associated with the feminine. And meanwhile, spirit or energy, elements such as air or fire, associated with the masculine. The great secret of the alchemists is the discovery that this masculine spirit, this animating force, this spark of the divine, can be found in ordinary physical matter. The prima materia, which, as we discussed last time, was said to be so many things that it's almost useless to say what the alchemists as a whole regarded it to be. But, its common associations with earth and water and the chthonic make the significance clear. The prima materia, the world of matter, is the mother of this filius macrocosmi, the cosmic sun. Again, filius macrocosmi being another word for the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone. And, it's concealed in her womb, so to speak, right? The child that the alchemists sought to produce. It would be a child of both the chthonic feminine and the spiritual masculine, the revelation of the numinous, of the spiritual, within the world of matter. The form that it takes is said to be various things, as Jung lists them. The alchemical gold, or a tincture of miraculous transformation, and so on and so forth. And so, just as with the prima materia, it's impossible to say precisely what they thought the great work would be, because they thought it was so many things and had so many contradicting ideas. So perhaps it's actually more elucidating to speak of it in vague terms, that alchemy is the attempt to create this conjunction, this marriage of the masculine spirit with the feminine material, and thus produce a substance, a son, which is both, a substance that is an incarnation of the divine, or reveals the divine within the material world. And so in the same way that, Christ is God in incarnate form within the Christian religion, it's the divine spirit manifest in a human being. And, because of that, that's why Christ can perform miracles and do things that no one else can do. The philosopher's stone, or, the product of the magnum opus, would be the divine spirit manifest in ordinary matter, and thus able to do things that no other form of matter would be able to do. And what does Jung say after all of this? That this is, as we discussed last week, a process that was constantly adulterated with the psychological projections of the alchemists themselves, such that there is little about this project that we can justifiably say has to do with chemistry, at least in the ordinary sense. Although, as mentioned, we did discuss the very real contributions of the alchemists to the establishment of modern-day chemistry. But as far as the great work is concerned for Jung, it is a psychological work. And the fact that the alchemists didn't understand this and projected the work onto chemical transformations, that's actually essential for it remaining a psychological work. Remember that it was when the esoteric and the hermetical aspects of alchemy began to branch off from the chemical aspects that Jung says, in his opinion, alchemy began to degenerate, as he puts it. These esotericists became pure philosophers, and the alchemists who stayed in the lab became empirical chemists. The real treasure hard to attain, for Jung anyway, is the tremendous insight into the human mind that the alchemists provide to us by authoring these texts that essentially serve as a record of their active imagination, as he puts it. So in Jung's language, they're doing the same thing that we do when we dream, and here he makes it explicit because Jung has a very serious concern with dreams. And perhaps I didn't make that as clear or as explicit in the previous episode, that for Jung, dreams are the mind's process for the unconscious to communicate with the consciousness, or as he says here, to irrigate the consciousness, which is a much more, probably a better term than communication, because it sort of suggests, a process of natural growth that isn't necessarily, communication has all this baggage that we might, associate with intentionality and so on and so forth. But the key thing is that dreams are not random nightly flights of fancy that ought to be forgotten. The dreaming mind is engaged in a productive process. And for Jung, that process is the push toward individuation, the recentering of the self around a more complete center that incorporates both the conscious and the unconscious mind. And oftentimes, to the extent that the dream is or can be called communication, it's often telling the conscious self that something isn't right, or it's compensating the conscious self in some way for something that's imbalanced or missing in conscious life. There's some aspect of life that's been ignored. Perhaps there's some drive that's running out of control, or a desire that's unfulfilled, or maybe there's a fear that's dominating the conscious life. Just something that the ego has refused to acknowledge. And as Jung states at the beginning of the book, the fact that these patterns of imagery, certain archetypal figures and narratives tend to repeat independently of the cultural background or the individual background of the dreaming subject, that suggests to him that there is some sort of goal of the unconsciousness as such, the human unconsciousness, that is not bounded to a particular cultural instantiations or a particular individual's life. There's some sort of end to this project in which the unconsciousness sort of engages with the conscious mind. And his contention here, as elsewhere, is that this integration of the conscious and unconscious self, the creation of wholeness, The point of it is to create a self that is not at war with itself, if we may put it like that. We are, as Jung would have said, and as Nietzsche would have said, and Freud, a multiplicitous thing. The purpose of individuation would be to take that multiplicitous self and make it nevertheless ordered, so that every drive and every aspect is in some sort of harmonious relation, or at least maybe we might say the competitive or rival drives exercise their hostility in a productive way. And so Jung's contention would be, just as this unconscious goal of the dreaming experience is to push the self toward individuation, the alchemists, we might call them the dreamers of Christendom, right? This esoteric and secretive and thus underground sect of philosophers of ancient times and throughout the Middle Ages, they also became engaged in this project of imagining or allegorizing this project of individuation. And that's what their great work really was, the achievement of self-integration. That's the real goal, the real magnum opus. Or at least that's what it symbolizes, even if that wasn't something they were aware of. The reason then why there is a parallel between the lapis, the philosopher's stone, and we might say the ideal of Christ, right? Christ as a symbol of the self, or as someone you ought to imitate. In Jung's view, the reason why this is that Christ as a symbol of the self is a symbol of individuation, right? Within waking life, for the ordinary Christian, that is their symbol, so to speak, whereas the stone becomes the symbol of individuation for the alchemical dreamers, so to speak. Now, of course, the ordinary Christian may have been confused by this or even seen it as heretical, as we quoted from Jung last time, saying, these two sons, the filius macrocosmi and the Son of God, were never united in any way, really, except in the imagination of some particularly gifted alchemists. But Jung would caution the Christians not to jump to such conclusions. To the modern-day Christian audience who might read him, he would caution them not to just jump to such conclusions as, alchemy and all sorts of esotericism, hermeticism, that's just heretical and we can safely dismiss it. Jung writes, quote, "The alchemist always stresses his humility and begins his treatises with invocations to God. He does not dream of identifying himself with Christ. On the contrary, it is the coveted substance, the lapis, that he likens to Christ. It is not really a question of identification at all, but of the hermeneutical sicut, that is, as, or like, which characterizes the analogy. For medieval man, however, analogy was not so much a logical figure as a secret identity, a remnant of primitive thinking which is still very much alive. An instructive example of this is the rite of hallowing the fire on the Saturday before Easter. The fire is, quote, like unto Christ, in imago Christi. The stone from which the spark is struck is the cornerstone, another imago, and the spark that leaps from the stone is again an imago Christi. The analogy with the extraction of the pneuma from the stone in the saying of Osthenes forces itself upon us. We are already familiar with the idea of pneuma as fire, and with Christ as fire, and fire as the earth's inner counter-element. Without knowing it, the alchemist carries the idea of the imitation a stage further, and reaches the conclusion we mentioned earlier: the complete assimilation to the Redeemer would enable him, the assimilated, to continue the work of redemption in the depths of his own psyche. The conclusion is unconscious, and consequently, the alchemist never feels impelled to assume that Christ is doing the work in him. It is by virtue of the wisdom and art which he himself has acquired, or which God has bestowed upon him, that he can liberate the world, creating nous, or logos, lost in the world's materiality, for the benefit of mankind. The artifacts himself bears no correspondence to Christ. Rather, he sees this correspondence to the Redeemer in his wonderful stone." End quote. So the parallel is quite clear. By, quote, freeing the pneuma, the spirit, from dark, mundane materiality, the alchemist dreamed that he could benefit all mankind, but not as though he himself were a new savior or equivalent to Christ. He prayed to God to reveal the mystery to him. He didn't see himself arrogantly as, I am the one who will gift the stone to all of you. The stone was a discovery that was waiting to be uncovered in the material world by the grace of God. And while Jung is primarily discussing medieval alchemy, and so he's necessarily talking about the Christian version of this whole psychological process throughout most of the book. Going back to ancient times, there were Greek conceptions of the divine, Egyptian or even Islamic conceptions of the divine that all fueled the alchemical project. But they all shared in that idea that the secret has to be revealed by a divine force that's beyond humanity. And we also have that, or the recapitulation to correspondence thinking, or thinking by analogy, although Jung points out it goes further. The fire is an image of Christ. It is like Christ, and therefore it is Christ, right? There's some secret identity between fire and Christ. It's not simply a metaphor, nor is it literal, though. It's a third thing, right? It's correspondence, it's synchronicity, it's a true symbol. And I say true symbol because the way I mean to use the term here, it's not in the vulgar sense as though that which appears or that which signifies is somehow less than the quote-unquote true world. Jung would say that the nature of the psyche is that signifiers conceal and reveal at the same time. So the association of Christ with fire reveals something to us about the nature of Christ, the fiery nature of the Spirit. At the same time, it's not literally Christ. It is a symbol of Christ. But nevertheless, it's like unto Christ in that way. And again, by analogy, the Philosopher's Stone is the same. It's a discovery that would redeem the world of matter. It would benefit the entirety of mankind the way that Christ did. It's not literally Christ, but its association with Christ is more than a mere metaphor. It's a symbol that stands for the same thing, redemption, to speak in the Christian language, or to speak in psychological language, individuation. They both stand for the same thing, and so they are like unto one another. But remember what we discussed last time. There is a compensatory movement within the unconsciousness, not complementary. So the unconsciousness parallels the consciousness in strange ways, often in reverse, but not by producing a mere opposite, if that makes sense. So the example from the last episode that Jung uses is that the unconsciousness doesn't compensate for the relative absence of the divine feminine in the Christian worldview by creating a salvific daughter to match the salvific son. Rather, it creates another quote-unquote son, but contained within the feminine world of matter. Likewise here, the alchemist is not comparing himself to Christ. He's engaged in something rather strange from the Christian perspective. It's another complement or complementary movement of the unconsciousness that produces almost the reversal or the inversion of the redemption of man by God. Jung writes, quote, "Had the alchemist succeeded in forming any concrete idea of his unconscious contents, he would have been obliged to recognize that he had taken the place of Christ, or to be more exact, that he regarded not as ego but as self had taken over the work of redeeming, not man, but God. He would have then had to recognize not only himself as the equivalent of Christ, but Christ as a symbol of the self. This tremendous conclusion failed to dawn on the medieval mind. What seems like a monstrous presumption to the Christian European would have been self-evident to the spirit of the Upanishads." End quote. Okay, what does he mean by this? Well, in Vedic philosophy and religion, which is where the Upanishads come out of, one of the most important principles is this notion that, contained within every man is Brahman. Or to speak more precisely, it's not contained within, every person is Brahman. That's to say, we are all coterminous with and analogous with the Godhead that comprises the totality of all existence. The creation of the universe, in fact, is the Godhead's forgetting of itself as being the Godhead, incarnating into all these conscious forms that then enact the play, lila, of being individual, striving, being different, suffering, separate things. But it is just a play, right? In that sense, in the sense of a drama, but also in the sense of playing. Behind the veil of Maya, or illusion, we forget what we truly are, which is, to put it in Western language, God. And so in Jung's reading of the Upanishads, we could regard that Vedic philosophy as, you could to put it into Jung's language, it's aimed at mankind, quote unquote, redeeming the God that dwells within them, to realize, to recognize, as the famous phrase goes within Advaita Vedanta, tat tvam asi, thou art that. You don't need to go seeking elsewhere outside of yourself to find God. God is within you. And in fact, it's more profound than that. God is you. God is everything that exists. There is no separation. That's a complete, you are identical with the Godhead, right? And so in some sense, the redemption is found in the fact that you are already redeemed, or that you don't even need redeeming. But we can see the analogy that Jung is sort of drawing to alchemy, of man redeeming God, right? Now, the medieval Christians, of course, were unfamiliar with the Upanishads, and that's why Jung says they would have found it to be a monstrous proposition that man must redeem God. In the hierarchical feudal mindset, in the worldview governed by a personal God who is referred to as the Lord, and all of us as his servants, it's sort of an affront to God. It sort of lowers God. To say that man must redeem God, that's blasphemy. It's antithetical to the Christian worldview. But we can see that what's going on here, it's not indicative of some hostility to Christianity on the part of the alchemists. Like, man redeeming God, what is meant by this is the same thing that the Vedic philosophy indicates, finding the Brahman within you. But here instead, the alchemists, they're trying to find the spirit within matter, right? And if we follow Jung's psychological interpretation, what this would seem to indicate is a shift of perspective, to see it as the work of the individual, or of the fully individuated and integrated self, to discover, to redeem the divine within himself. Or rather, if you're not yet such an integrated self, perhaps we can say that his unconsciousness, by aiming him at that end goal, right? That's like it's like his integrated self reaching back from the potential future where it's fully realized, to guide the ego to that future throughout the process, right? But the key thing for Jung is that this represents sort of like an inkling of the new spiritual age that was still hundreds of years off in the times of the alchemists, but which is now beginning to dawn in the Western psyche. And perhaps that's why Jung would see alchemy as such a significant development. And in Jung's language, this is the understanding that there is no God outside of the self. Now, the materialist atheist will hear that statement and perhaps think it's an affirmation of his atheism, but that's really not what Jung means. He believed that the externalizing of God, like the reification of God as an external being, that's a stepping stone on the path to a more mature spirituality that instead sees the unity of self and God. And so in this long project of alchemy, again, Jung sees sort of like the faintest inkling of that idea, right? That there is no God outside of the self, sort of playing at the edges of the alchemists' work and their writings. But as he says, it doesn't dawn as a completely articulated and consciously expressed form of this idea. It's still just sort of, perhaps it's the false dawn, the first light you see on the horizon at the end of nighttime. Now, one might ask why a savior or a redeemer might be necessary in the first place. Why should we expect such an archetype to appear in the minds of alchemists? Why should this be part of the work of psychic integration that we would require a redeemer? Jung answers this actually in the concluding section of Psychology and Alchemy, quote, "Since the psychological condition of any unconscious content is one of potential reality, characterized by the polar opposites being and not being, it follows that the union of opposites must play a decisive role in the alchemical process. The result is something in the nature of a uniting symbol, and this usually has a numinous character. The projection of the Redeemer image, i.e. the correspondence between Christ and the lapis, is therefore almost a psychological necessity, with the essential difference that the Christian opus is an operare in honor of God the Redeemer, undertaken by man who stands in need of redemption, while the alchemical opus is the labor of man the Redeemer in the cause of the divine world soul, slumbering and awaiting redemption in matter. The alchemist creates for himself a panacea of life, which he regards either as a substitute for the Church's means of grace or as a complement and parallel of the divine work of redemption that is continued in man, end quote. So this is the reason why a Redeemer is needed, and why Christ is able to fulfill this function as the image of the self in Jung's understanding of Western psychology. Because we might say, why would it be the goal to become Christ, this inhuman character who has no worldly desires, who never laughs, who never sires children, who doesn't work a job like the rest of us, who ultimately holds to a standard of virtue that the vast majority of people could never hope to reach, right? There's the explanation in the Christian church for why we ought to imitate Christ, but does this really work as a psychological reality? Well, the aspect Jung focuses on is the unifying aspect, matter and spirit contained in one being, or as he says, being and not being, right? A true dichotomy. And Jung's experience as a psychoanalyst, it tells him that this is quite literally the nature of the psychic work of integration, reconciling apparently irreconcilable opposites, right? Now, why would that be the case? Well, because precisely what it means to be disintegrated, to have a self that it is in disarray and disorder and conflict, that's to be torn by two irreconcilable opposites within the self. And that could mean in practical terms any number of things. The desire to work a job with a decent wage, but the equal and opposite desire to, live a life of poverty for the sake of, say, art or travel or whatever else. The desire to be married and take care of your wife and kids, but the irreconcilable desire to go sleep with a new lover. The desire to carry on the legacy of your family, honor the wishes of your parents, set against an irreconcilable desire to go your own way in life, perhaps a life path that your family would not approve of. And there are just countless examples of these irreconcilable drives that can manifest, that can coexist within a single individual, who then feels as though the unstoppable force has hit an unmovable object within himself, and feels that they're at a crossroads and cannot go in either direction without sacrificing their happiness in some way. And almost all of us will come to such crossroads in our lives at some point, and will feel as though, you can't live without fulfilling this drive and this other drive, but they're irreconcilable. They're both vehement drives, and yet they cannot coexist, and yet I must have both of them, right? The two roads lead in opposite directions, and so you can't go in both, and so you find yourself torn between them, quite literally ripped asunder. A true dichotomy, and thus a true dilemma, right? Dilemma, of course, meaning two horns. You go in one direction and you're gored by one horn, you go in the other and you're gored by the other horn. And so what is the individual to do, right? And this is where individuation comes in. It's integration of these irreconcilable aspects. That would seem to be, from this perspective, at those decision points, at those crossroad points in your life, this will become the most important, the most needful thing in the world for you. And yet, it's like asking for a miracle, isn't it? Because it requires a union of two things that are mutually exclusive. And that would be impossible, except for God, right? For the divine, to whom nothing is impossible. And so this is the real meaning of the felt necessity for a redeemer. It's the solver and redeemer, as they said in alchemy, right? It is the requirement that two absolutely opposite and mutually exclusive aspects of the self somehow be united into one being. And so sometimes this is expressed with imagery we discussed at the end of the last episode of the hermaphrodite, of the brother-sister pair, the mysterious conjunction, or the chemical wedding. But Jung would say that ultimately this is the reason why integration aims at a miraculous figure or a miraculous symbol at the center of it all, because true and complete wholeness, again, it just rationally speaking, empirically speaking, would seem to be an impossible thing, the stuff of fairy tales and miracles. The alchemists' seemingly heretical innovation that man would redeem the divine is in fact the inkling of a higher understanding of this psychic process, the realization that the work to bring about that mysterious or miraculous unifier within the self, that in fact that exists within you already, that in fact it is a self-driven process, a self-contained process. Not because we have no help from God, but because God, again, is within. and the self cannot, as it were, sit and wait for the intercession of the divine. Perhaps that is the more mature, the next step in Western spirituality, because it moves us away from that other power orientation, that I can just sort of sit and wait for God to take care of it. Jung would say that, the recognition that there is no God outside sort of takes away that potentially disempowering orientation, because the divine is already here, right? The divine is already in you. And so it's time to get to work, right? Get to work on your own individuation. You can't wait for anyone else to come and save you. In Jung's view, this project of individuation, driven by the recognition of the divine within, can only take place now in the modern age, because we first had to overcome past attitudes that predominated within the social and moral reality of past ages. Jung writes, quote, "This is a modern problem, insofar as it needed the hypertrophy of collective life and the herding together of incredible masses of people in our own day to make the individual aware that he was being suffocated in the toils of the organized mob. The collectivism of the medieval church seldom or never exerted sufficient pressure on the individual to turn his relations with society into a general problem. So this question too remained on the level of projection, and it was reserved for our own day to tackle it with at least an embryonic degree of consciousness under the mask of neurotic individualism." End quote. Now, Jung concludes the book with a number of observations about Faust, regarded as an alchemical drama, as well as Thus Spoke Zarathustra, also regarded from that standpoint. This perspective on these works is not novel to Jung. Many had pointed out the alchemical symbolism, certainly in Faust. Jung sees these works as a sort of crescendo of the alchemical symbolism in Western culture and art. But Jung essentially sees both of these works as falling victim to the problem of identifying with the Redeemer. And this is a very subtle distinction, but it is the difference between seeing one's ego as the Redeemer and seeing one's self as the Redeemer. Remember, the self in Jungian terms goes well beyond the ego. And as he's sort of implied throughout this document, it includes the power of the divine within it. It's not that lonely, separate ego consciousness, and it's not going to achieve the unity through rational problem solving, as the ego always tries to do. So Jung writes about Faust, quote, "Faust's sin was that he identified with the thing to be transformed, and that had been transformed. Nietzsche overreached himself by identifying his ego with the Superman Zarathustra, the part of the personality that was struggling into consciousness." End quote. Now, I must admit, I find many of Jung's comments on these works to be disagreeable. I think much of what he regards as the failure of Zarathustra or Faust has more to do with the fact that Jung's project is simply very different in nature from the project of Nietzsche or Goethe, and he also recapitulates to some interpretations that I would disagree with. For example, that Nietzsche's philosophy is somehow responsible for the collectivist madness that swept the Western world during the 20th century. But I bring up these remarks here for the reason of illustrating that Jung's version of individualism is very different from what might be ordinarily meant by that label. The integration of the self, the creation of a true individual, is paradoxically the product of a unity of the separate individual with the collective property of all mankind, which is to say the archetypes. The creation of the self is the work of discovering the pneuma, the spirit, the divine spark within that exists within all mankind, and aims all mankind at the mysterious goal of wholeness. And so Jung's problem with Goethe is perhaps a criticism that Nietzsche would have actually agreed with, that, quote, "Faust's final rejuvenation takes place only in the post-mortal state, i.e. is projected into the future," end quote. And Jung brings up how Faust's child with Helen of Troy, Euphorion, which we might recognize as a figure who ought to be portrayed as the filius macrocosmi, the cosmic son, does not endure, but he perishes. The same thing about the homunculus, right? The homunculus is sort of an explicitly alchemical symbol when Faust returns to visit with the scholar Wagner, and part 2 of Faust, and they're trying to create a human being through chemical processes, right? But of course, I believe his vial is smashed and the homunculus is crushed, right? Or he dies upon being exposed to the air. And on the other hand, Jung's problem with Nietzsche is that he says, God is dead. We must become supermen in order to deal with this problem. But the creation of something which is beyond the human as such, from Jung's point of view, necessitates the work of God, which is to say, the miraculous spirit within, right? To become supermen, to transcend ourselves as we are now, we actually can't afford to believe that God is dead. Again, there is no God outside, but Nietzsche rules out the possibility of God's rebirth in some new form, of God speaking in a new voice, right? A rejuvenation of the numinous in the Western psyche, in which there is no God outside, but there is a God inside. And, we discussed in the initial episodes that we did on Jung, which was last season, particularly in his interpretation of Nietzsche. This is all part of like a larger Jungian disagreement with Nietzsche's entire perspective, right? So for Jung, we can't get away from the collective unconscious, which means we can't get away from that world of gods and demons and spirits and monsters and, yes, miracles and synchronicity and antiodromias and so on. You can say God is dead, but God will continue to return, right? Which is to say the unconscious will continue tugging at the edges of your perception. The numinous will continue to break into the apparently rational, mechanistic world that we've created for ourselves. Gods are always dying and always being reborn, but that simply represents a changing of the mask, as he says, the divine adopting a new mask. The archetypal forms, the numinous forces within the self, certain signifiers or outward representations or manifestations or symbols of them may change. One might fade into the background, but that doesn't mean that the divine has gone away, right? It's an archetype changing the way it's perceived and experienced because no one signifier is enough to contain the totality of the divine. So at this point, we've conveyed most of the main ideas of psychology and alchemy, at least in broad strokes, and this book is a tome, and it's worth noting there is another volume on the same topic, Mysterium Conjunctionis, which is, I think, even longer than Psychology and Alchemy. And that could take another 2 episodes to cover in any depth, so maybe we will return to Jung talking about alchemy in the future. But what you will find if you go and read these books for yourself is that most of what we have glossed over in these talks is Jung's analysis of the specific examples of alchemical texts and the analysis of specific symbolism within. So, for example, on the section on the lapis Christ parallel, he goes through the whole history of Western alchemists invoking Christ as a corollary for the lapis, beginning with Raymond Lull. Raymond Lull was one of the earliest occultists, arguably the writer of the first true novel in the Western canon. So if you're interested in the subject, you'll get a lot out of that. I just didn't want in these episodes to spend so much time getting into those details, except to the degree that it was necessary to convey the main ideas. In other words, I'm just trying to say you can go way deeper into this than we have, even after hours of talking about this. But the question may remain, and this is what we're going to talk about for the rest of the episode. What relevance does any of this have for the average person's life, especially as we now live in the modern age? This whole alchemical language of signifiers and symbols, which Jung has extrapolated into a psychological language of the unconscious, speaking through our projections, that's all very interesting, but what good is any of it for us today? I can imagine many of you reaching this point in the episode saying to yourselves, well, what am I to do with this information, right? Well, we're going to do something unorthodox and return now to the beginning of the book, to the first section after the introduction. And I skipped the section when beginning these episodes because while this structure of the book works very well for Jung's purposes, insofar as he's making an argument for the psychoanalytic validity of studying alchemical imagery, I don't think it would work as well for the podcast's purposes, because the first section consists of essentially an extended journal of dreams and daydreams by a single patient, coupled with Jung's commentary. Jung, at least I believe this is why, I think he front loads the book with this dream analysis because it would seem to validate his assertions that alchemical symbolism is relevant to a psychological study, right? The dreams that Jung's patient recorded contain the symbolism in droves. But how could that be, right? Unless, of course, the alchemical symbolism is not something culturally bounded or something the alchemists just came up with as an arbitrary creation of the consciousness, but reflect instead something perhaps in the collective unconscious. So Jung writes, quote, "The material consists of over 1,000 dreams and visual impressions coming from a young man of excellent scientific education. For the purposes of this study, I have worked on the first 400 dreams and visions, which covered a period of nearly 10 months. In order to avoid all personal influence, I asked one of my pupils, a woman doctor who was then a beginner, to undertake the observation of the process. This went on for 5 months. The dreamer then continued his observations alone for 3 months. Except for a short interview at the very beginning, before the commencement of the observation, I did not see the dreamer at all during the first 8 months. Thus it happened that 355 of the dreams were dreamed away from any personal contact with myself. Only the last 45 occurred under my observation. No interpretations worth mentioning were then attempted because the dreamer, owing to his excellent scientific training and ability, did not require any assistance. Hence, conditions were really ideal for unprejudiced observation and recording." End quote. And further down he writes, quote, "It goes without saying that while the dreamer was under the observation of my pupil, he knew nothing of these interpretations and was therefore quite unprejudiced by anybody else's opinion." End quote. So this young man of a scientific background finds in his dreams a progression of images and symbolism that would have been unmistakable to the alchemists, and that's already quite strange. And one might naturally accuse Jung of adulterating the results through his influence, which is why he's so careful to say, no, the dreamer did this on his own for the vast majority of the process. He recorded this and analyzed it himself, entirely outside of my influence or even my observation. And the subject also dreams, toward the end of the sequence, an increasing frequency of mandalas. A mandala is a circular image, typically symmetrical, geometrically balanced. It's found in Eastern religions as an object of reverence and contemplation, but Jung would say we have our Western mandalas as well. These, sort of like circular depictions of the macrocosm or of the divine. I mean, for example, he includes an engraving from 1617 of the Anima Mundi, the guide of mankind. She's placed at the center of these concentric circles, symbolizing the earth and the heavenly spheres around it. This kind of imagery becomes more and more pronounced within the dreams as the dreamer proceeds further in his project of psychic integration. And this would seem to indicate to Jung, at least, that the mandala is another symbol of the goal of the process. And he would say mandalas appear in alchemical symbolism all the time. Importantly, however, Jung says that the symbols are not concerned with the manifold stages of transformation as such, right? The stages of the alchemical work that we discussed in the previous episode, for example. Rather, the symbols express the coming into being of a new center of consciousness. What does that mean? Well, individuation is, to put it in different words, quote, the centralizing process or the production of a new center of personality, end quote. This new center is what Jung calls the self, again, not the ego. Individuation involves the abandonment of the ego as center and the relocation of the center as the middle of the totality of the whole psyche. So it sits between the conscious and the unconsciousness, or includes both. Well, that's how one learns to self-identify. It's a union of opposites in that way. And so the dreams, in other words, don't guide you as a kind of step-by-step, do-it-yourself series of instructions. That would be complementary, and the unconscious, to say it again, does not complement the consciousness. It compensates it. Jung says that dreams whose meaning supports the conscious attitude might be possible, right? But as a rule, they're rare. And so ultimately what we're reading in this sequence is the unconscious response to what the ego consciousness is doing. It doesn't instruct the consciousness in the form of telling us what to do. It reveals what the consciousness can't or won't see. It shows what the consciousness wants but has willfully ignored. Or it shows the consciousness its deficiencies, or it shows the consciousness how its efforts in one direction undermine it in some other direction, or so on and so forth. Now, there are just a couple other points that I feel I should also mention. Jung admits dream interpretation is a fraught enterprise, that bringing to bear one's interpretation on an isolated, contextless dream is somewhat misguided. And further, that not every image or symbol in a dream can be regarded as something collective. A symbol that at first glance might be regarded as a clear-cut archetypal image from the Jungian's perspective may in fact have special significance to the dreamer's waking life. And so Jung draws our attention to these problems in order to show us how he's actively mitigating them, right? It's only in a sequence in which the dreams are interpreted in context with one another and with knowledge of the problems in the patient's waking life that he's working through that Jung feels secure to draw these conclusions. And so we're going to spend the rest of the episode considering this dream progression and how these images and these themes develop and shift and build upon one another as the waking subject works through his psychological difficulties, which Jung knows, but he can't really tell us many of those details for privacy reasons. And it was important for Jung, I think, to include this section of the work first in order to legitimize the rest of the book, from the perspective of thinking about a skeptical psychologist attempting to read psychology and alchemy. But I think for our purposes, it's going to be a lot more fun to consider the dreams now that we've absorbed all of this information about the basic concepts of alchemy. And that way, as we work through a selection of these dreams in the sequence that I've picked out, we'll be able to recognize or at least plausibly infer the symbolic meaning more or less immediately, right? And I say a selection because, there's 400 dreams here, or however many. Going over all of them would be fun. That would take hours. So I've picked some of the most thematically powerful dreams. Oh, and another thing I should mention, some of these, as I mentioned, are daydreams, or they're hypnotically produced sort of visual impressions. Jung he does tell us when it's one or the other, but he includes dreams with daydreams, which again, some people might have a problem with, but Jung would say the active imagination and the dreaming mind sort of come from the same place. But in any case, we're going to start with dream number 4. Quote, "The dreamer is surrounded by a throng of vague female forms. A voice within him says, 'First, I must get away from father,'" end quote. And I think the interesting thing about this dream is a Freudian could have a field day with it, right? In terms of, you could interpret it as, being surrounded by sort of images of feminine sexuality and wanting to get away from the governing, legislating superego that, the seeing a father or mother figure within the dream when one is confronted by imagery that could be sexually alluring. That's actually a very common dream experience that many people have, and sort of speaks to that, again, psychic disintegration, right? Usually some sort of urge or drive, that judgment from either an authority figure or perhaps just from the moral impositions of the collective. Again, the content that Freud would attribute to the superego. That's something that we see in this first dream. But Jung, of course, correlates this with the encounter with the anima. It's sort of a multiplicitous anima. It's not a single female figure. He includes some pictures of Melusina, the two-headed mermaid. And in Jung's commentary, he writes, quote, "The experience of the unconscious is a personal secret communicable only to very few, and that with difficulty. Hence the isolating effect. But isolation brings about a compensatory animation of the psychic atmosphere, which strikes us as uncanny. The figures that appear in the dream are feminine, thus pointing to the feminine nature of the unconscious. They are fairies or fascinating sirens and lamias who infatuate the lonely wanderer and lead him astray. Likewise, seductive maidens appear at the beginning of the Nekia of Polyphilo, and the Melusina of Paracelsus is another such figure," end quote. So he's pointing out how these sort of Sirens or fairies or multiplicitous, perhaps seductive feminine figures, symbols of the unconscious in general, but specifically the anima. These appear in the images and the writings, the symbolism of alchemists. Let's move on to number 5. This is a visual impression, so an active imagination. Quote, "A snake describes a circle round the dreamer who stands rooted to the ground like a tree." End quote. So there's going to be quite a bit of this circular imagery of the magic circle, something of that nature. But again, should immediately call to mind the sort of the circular nature of the mandala. And what is it that creates this circle around the dreamer, or in this case, around the waking dreamer doing a visual impression? It's a snake. And Jung writes, quote, "The fact that the dreamer stands rooted to the center is a compensation of his almost insuperable desire to run away from the unconscious. He experienced an agreeable feeling of relief after this vision, and rightly, since he has succeeded in establishing a protected temenos, a taboo area where he will be able to meet the unconscious." End quote. And a temenos is Jung actually says it in a footnote. I'll just read his footnote. "A piece of land, often a grove, set apart and dedicated to a god." So again, another term for that sort of consecrated ground, magic circle imagery. And it's created by a snake, which is often, snakes appear often in symbols of spirituality, but the snake has that sort of dual character, especially in the West, that is always included in sort of the alchemical imagery, right? The unification of opposites, the mingling of sulfur and salt, hermaphroditic imagery, and so on and so forth. So the snake is often associated with Satan, right? But what does the snake give to Adam and Eve? He seduces them to seek the knowledge of good and evil, right? So he offers them wisdom. And, Nietzsche, his serpent in Zarathustra, that's the reason why one of the animals of Zarathustra is a serpent. And so the serpent coiling around you and creating the temenos, one could say it's a mercurial type of image, right? It is the serpent, the giver of wisdom, that nevertheless has that connotation of perhaps wickedness, perhaps it's Promethean in that way, giving us wisdom that we really shouldn't have. But that's the thing that creates the protective circle around the dreamer, even though, like in the Adam and Eve story, the serpent is the thing that basically destroys the protective, it expels man from the garden, the thing contained within the temenos, right? Let's move on to number 6, which is another visual impression, which Jung says directly follows upon 5, quote, "The veiled figure of a woman seated on a stair." End quote. And Jung says, quote, "The motif of the unknown woman, whose technical name is the anima, appears here for the first time. Like the throng of vague female forms in Dream 4, she is a personification of the animated psychic atmosphere. From now on, the figure of the unknown woman reappears in a great many of the dreams. Personification always indicates an autonomous activity of the unconscious." End quote. So this veiled figure of a woman, the veil, I think, is significant because she is a personified, concrete, singular figure whose identity is nevertheless concealed, hidden behind a veil, and seated on a stair. I mean, that's classic alchemical imagery. You often see the images of the ladder or the staircase to symbolize ascending the stages on the great work. And Jung would say that sort of imagery appears in dreams all the time. But I think this ties in with the fact that Jung would say, we discussed this in the episode on Jungian archetypes last season, that there are sort of gatekeeper archetypes that you have to encounter as you embark on the work of psychic integration. So the shadow is the first archetype you're always going to have to deal with. And then after that, for men anyway, it'll be the anima, and for women, it'll be the animus. But the anima sort of is standing between the dreamer and the next phase, ascending the staircase to the next phase of the process. But the interesting thing to me is that he sees this as a visual impression, as part of the active imagination, and then, as Jung says, this sort of like unknown woman becomes a recurring figure in the dreams of the patient afterwards. We're going to skip now to dream number 12. Quote, a dangerous walk with father and mother up and down many ladders, end quote. And Jung points out in his commentary here that, having your father and mother accompany you on this journey is sort of like the indication of a childish consciousness, or that there's some sort of potential regression or potential for regression going on. Quote, a childish consciousness is always tied to father and mother and is never by itself. Return to childhood is always the return to father and mother, to the whole burden of the psychic non-ego as represented by the parents, with its long and momentous history, end quote. And then further down in his interpretation, Jung says, as hinted above, the steps and ladders theme points to the process of psychic transformation with all its ups and downs, end quote. So, and then he points out after that we see this in the work of Zosimos, one of the alchemists, the ascent and descent of the 15 steps of light and darkness. So, once again, the images of stairs or ladders appearing in the alchemist's work, and then we already see how, it's part of why I selected the dreams in this order, or the dreams and visual impressions in this order, is that he has the visual impression of the woman seated on the staircase, and then later we see that imagery appear in his dreams themselves. Let's move on to number 13. Quote, the father calls out anxiously, that is the seventh, end quote. And as Jung points out, in the many of the esoteric traditions, 7 is the highest stage, and as we discussed with the sort of the 7 alchemical substances, 7 different transformations that can be made, the gold, the philosophical gold, that is the 7th, right? And so the voice of the father of the dreamer sort of pointing him in the direction, in symbolism which is unmistakably esoteric or alchemical, pointing him in the direction of the end of the work, of the psychic wholeness. But then why is the father figure anxious about it, right? Well, Jung says it's no wonder that the father is scared and anxious. Quote, if this interpretation that the 7th represents the highest stage of illumination is correct, it would mean in principle that the process of integrating the personal unconscious was actually at an end. Thereafter, the collective unconscious would begin to open up, which would suffice to explain the anxiety the father felt as the representative of the traditional spirit, end quote. So again, that association of the parents with, again, I'm using Freudian language because I think it's really easy to grasp, like the superego being the inculcation in the individual of the traditional or the collective morality. Typically, a father figure stands for that kind of thing. It can also stand for the dreamer's literal father or literal mother in waking life. The parents can. But that's the interesting thing about the way Jung thinks about dream symbolism, right? So, we might say in ordinary language or in just sort of the dismissive way that we might look at dreams, just a flight of fancy, you might say, well, I saw something in the dream that was imagery that was right out of my waking life. I saw that the other day. That's probably why I dreamed about it. Jung would say that's not a why, right? That's the what. The thing that you dreamed about from conscious life, that's the what. It doesn't tell you the why. Why was that significant to dream about? Because you see all sorts of things in your conscious waking life that you don't necessarily dream about. Jung sort of flips it on its head, right? That the reason why you dream about something in waking life that has a clear significance to you in waking life is because the unconscious is using that as an analogy for what's going on in your unconsciousness. So it's, again, like unto, right? It's not metaphor, it's not literal, it's kind of both. So that's the problem with disentangling dreams just on their own, context-free, is that does the father stand for the literal father? Does he stand for an archetypal, symbolic father that might stand for the traditional morality or something of that nature? And really the answer is both. But it's because it's the unconscious is using the father of the dreamer, which is his actual father, but using him as a signifier for something else. At least that would be Jung's interpretation. Let's move on to number 14. Quote, "The dreamer is in America looking for an employee with a pointed beard. They say that everybody has such an employee," end quote. And Jung's comment I love here, quote, "America is the land of practical, straightforward thinking, uncontaminated by our European sophistication. The intellect would there be kept very sensibly as an employee." And further down he writes, quote, "The man with a pointed beard is our time-honored Mephisto whom Faust, quote, employed and who was not permitted to triumph over him in the end, despite the fact that Faust had dared to descend into the dark chaos of the historical psyche and steep himself in the ever-changing seamy side of life that rose up out of that bubbling cauldron," end quote. So, drawing a connection between Mephisto and the man with the pointed beard. And the man with the pointed beard is going to show up in many of the dreamer's future dreams and sense impressions as well. But remember what Jung has already said about Mephisto and Faust, that he's a mercurial character. Remember how in Faust, one of the witches that they encounter basically explicitly says, or I guess implicitly says, that Mephisto was once Woden. He was once the god Odin, right, who walked about the world with the one-eyed Odin with his two ravens, right? And that's a very sort of mysterious connection to draw, because the Norse certainly would not have seen Odin as satanic. He's one of their highest, most important gods, right? But as we see with the Woden or Odin association with Mercurius, with the god Mercury or Hermes, there is a very deep alchemical meaning to that association, as Goethe includes it in the work. Mercurius, we sort of have to call to mind all the things that we know about Mercurius from the previous episode of talking about this, as being that intercessory god. The figure who's there at the beginning of the work, synonymous with the prima materia, he's also there at the end of the work. He's the Ouroboros eating his tail, right? He's hermaphroditic in some portrayals. He's the beginning, middle, and end. He's there the whole time, because Mercury is the symbol of transformation as such, in a way, because Quicksilver is a changeable, sort of paradoxical type of substance. And so Jung here draws the connection of Mercurius with the intellect, or rather Mephisto with the intellect. And that is another very profound, very fecund association to draw, because it sort of points to a criticism of unbounded intellect, we might say, that intellect that becomes autonomous or separated from the irrational or the emotional, that is somewhat satanic, right? And that's very strange, again. If we think about it in classical Christian terms, you would say that, the devil is of the flesh, the devil is of the passions, and so on and so forth. But I think a more mature spiritual view would be that evil oftentimes is that which rationalizes or justifies itself, right? That true evil is normally not just giving in to hedonic desires. It's the person who is able to come up with some sort of intellectual justification for why their course of action is okay, why it's warranted, right? Even if it goes against all the traditional morality. And so there's an element of that in this as well. Again, the alchemical symbolism is, I don't want to call it amoral, but it's always morally gray or morally complex. That Mercurius could be a figure that's associated with, in this case, Satan, Mephisto. And yet, Mercurius is there at every stage of the work. He's the symbol of transformation. We might say, in Faust, once again, Mephisto is a force, a figure, a character that allows Faust to have his transformation without Satan getting involved in his life and taking him out to show him a wild time throughout all the pleasures and all the knowledge and all the experience that the world has to offer. Faust never would have become who he is, so to speak, right? And so that's another sort of, I guess, uncomfortable thing about alchemy and about this kind of, we might say, morally gray style of symbolic analysis from the perspective of like an old moralist, right? Who would say that the path to becoming, integrating your more complete or higher self should be necessarily a moral path. But that's not really the psychological reality of things. So let's move on to the next dream. Or rather, this is another visual impression. This is number 20. Quote, a globe. The unknown woman is standing on it and worshiping the sun. End quote. And we've kind of glossed over it because, again, there are so many dreams. Jung suggests over the course of the dreamer's work, there's been perhaps some regression or unwillingness to really comprehend or take in what the unconscious is trying to tell him. And so he says, quote, this impression is an amplification of Vision 7. The rejection of the dream evidently amounted to a destruction of the whole development up to that point. Consequently, the initial symbols reappear now, but in amplified form. Such enantiodromias are characteristic of dream sequences in general. Unless the conscious mind intervened, the unconscious would go on sending out wave after wave without result, like the treasure that is said to take 9 years, 9 months, and 9 nights to come to the surface, and if not found in the last night, sinks back to start over again from the beginning. End quote. So, in this visual impression, the unknown woman, she appears again. She's standing on a globe, and she is worshiping the sun. Again, the sun has that identity, that secret identity with the philosophical gold. That's what it represents. We, again, employ that correspondence thinking. We have the Father pointing, saying that is the seventh. We have the sun, which is the symbol of the philosophical gold, right? Sort of these indications of pointing the self toward what the end of the work is supposed to be. And the unknown woman, again, is the anima. Let's go to dream number 21. Quote, the dreamer is surrounded by nymphs. A voice says, we were always there, only you did not notice us. End quote. So again, it's what Jung calls circumambulation in some places, which is a term that's used, I believe, in sort of archaic religious term for circling. The way Muslims circle the Kaaba. That's circumambulation. I mean, ambulating, walking, right? Just walking in a circle. But Jung would say that's sort of it's not really a circle, it's a spiral, that there's a spiral path of the unconsciousness or of the psychic work. And that what happens is over the course of this psychic work, we pass by many of the same images or symbols or familiar figures, right? We have to repeatedly return to them. And that might seem like you're not making progress, like you're just circling, but, we might say that this impression is far more, what would we say? It's far more forceful and far more straightforward than the initial dream of just being surrounded by some female figures that, Jung speculates might indicate the unconscious. Here now they're actual nymphs, and here now the unconscious is speaking and saying, we were always there, but you didn't notice us, which is unmistakable language, really. And then we'll look at one more. This is another visual impression in this sequence. We're going to look at more dreams, but they're broken up into two sequences. So this is the last one of the initial sequence. Quote, in a primeval forest, an elephant looms up menacingly. Then a large ape man, bear, or caveman threatens to attack the dreamer with a club. Suddenly, the man with the pointed beard appears and stares at the aggressor so that he is spellbound. But the dreamer is terrified. The voice says, everything must be ruled by the light. End quote. And Jung's initial comment on this is, quote, the multiplicity of nymphs has broken down into still more primitive components. That is to say, the animation of the psychic atmosphere has very considerably increased, and from this we must conclude that the dreamer's isolation from his contemporaries has increased in proportion. End quote. I would also say, and Jung goes on to talk about this, when you encounter like a primitive man, like a caveman, or as he says here, a large ape man or a bear, that's typically a shadow symbol, because modern people, or really we might say any civilized people, tend to suppress or to, they stop themselves from self-identifying with their primitive or animalian aspects or drives within themselves, right? And so we have perhaps The elephant, which really seems like a symbol of just pure drive itself, right? Think about an elephant. They stampede. It's sort of like an unstoppable force. An elephant as an animal is really a great symbol of just drive itself. And then we have the shadow, the thing, we might say the part of the personality that wants to indulge those drives, that is hostile towards the dreamer who has perhaps suppressed those drives. And then it's the intellect, right? The satanic or mercurial intellect, the man with the pointed beard who shows up and sort of spellbinds the primitive man, the shadow side, the suppressed drives. And Jung's explanation for this, he writes, quote, "Who knows how much Faust owed his imperturbable curiosity as he gazed on the spooks and bogies of the classical Walpurgisnacht to the helpful presence of Mephisto and his matter-of-fact point of view. Would that more people could remember that scientific or philosophical reflections of the much-abused intellect at the right moment." And a little bit further down, he says, "The intellect may be the devil, but the devil is the strange son of chaos who can most readily be trusted to deal effectively with his mother. The Dionysian experience will give this devil plenty to do should he be looking for work." End quote. So, yeah, I think that's all fairly self-explanatory. Jung is saying there is, his position should not be taken. It can seem sometimes like Jung might be the kind of person who would say that we should sort of, the intellect is always like an obstacle we have to get around. Our rational, empirical, modern, mechanistic worldview is something that we always have to sort of undermine and sort of, in order to get into a more mythic or religious point of view, which might be necessary to get into that point of view in order to carry out this work of psychic integration, because there's so much that's irrational and just can't be comprehended within the modern mechanistic, empirical, scientific mind. But it has its time and place, right? The alternative is to kind of just throw away all of the gifts of civilization that have allowed us to suppress our feelings with our thoughts. And even though the intellect has this devilish quality because it's rationalizing in that way and oftentimes is used, maybe this is perhaps a point that's a bit too Nietzschean for the subject matter, but that the intellect or the reason is really just a relationship between drives, and that every drive speaks with its own form of reason, that it's a way of sort of making a post hoc rationalization to ourselves as to why whatever we wanted to do already, whatever we desire, whatever suits our advantage was the right thing to do, quote unquote. But there it is. Without the intellect there to sort of order and serve as that relating force, we would be wild men. We would be apes. We'd be animals again. Sure, it's an interesting point to bring up, and that we can trust the devilish intellect to do this because he is the son of chaos and can deal with his siblings that come out of the chaos of the eternal feminine, right? And then, of course, the voice at the end. Everything must be ruled by the light. Again, pointing the individual to the true object of his individuation. And it's a very disturbing vision, but once again, it has that guiding element or that guiding function. So let's move on to the next series of dreams, and we're going to start with number 6. Quote, "An unknown woman is pursuing the dreamer. He keeps running round in a circle." End quote. Jung's comment, "The snake in the first mandala dream was anticipatory, as is often the case when a figure personifying a certain aspect of the unconscious does or experiences something that the subject himself will experience later. The snake anticipates a circular movement in which the subject is going to be involved, i.e., something is taking place in the unconscious which is perceived as a circular movement, and this occurrence now presses into the consciousness so forcefully that the subject himself is gripped by it. The unknown woman or anima representing the unconscious continues to harass the dreamer until he starts running around in circles. This clearly indicates a personal center which is not identical with the ego and around which the ego revolves." End quote. And I've been kind of giving my own commentary or just kind of like trying to summarize or gloss through what Jung says. I think what Jung says about that dream is perfectly comprehensible, and we can move on from there. Let's go to number 8. Quote, "On board a ship, The dreamer is occupied with a new method of taking his bearings. Sometimes he is too far away and sometimes too near. The right spot is in the middle. There is a chart on which is drawn a circle with its center." End quote. So looking for a new center to the self, again, sort of hinting at a mandala imagery. We can see the dreamer is struggling. He's not there yet. He's in the middle of the work. He hasn't figured it out yet. But he's on board a ship in the middle of the ocean, which that's sort of unmistakable symbolism of sort of being on your little lonely bark in the sea of the unconsciousness. So let's move on. This is dream number 13 in this series. Quote, "In the sea there lies a treasure. To reach it, he has to dive through a narrow opening. This is dangerous, but down below he will find a companion. The dreamer takes the plunge into the dark and discovers a beautiful garden in the depths, symmetrically laid out, with a fountain in the center." End quote. And Jung's comment, I'll just read the beginning. "The treasure hard to attain lies hidden in the ocean of the unconscious, and only the brave can reach it." End quote. So, again, it's something, we might say, terrifying, something that diving into the depths of one's unconscious, into the dark depths, right? We can understand why only the brave would wish to venture to do this. But there's a promise you're going to find a companion down there. And again, the imagery, the symmetrical garden with the fountain at the center. All of this imagery seems to be just inevitably pulling the dreamer towards this new center of the self. And we should once again remember that the garden, right? Again, think of the Garden of Eden, this sort of like the walled off, perfect garden, right? The temenos, right? That's normally is a little grove or an area of hollowed ground, a little circular magic circle binding an area that's cordoned off for a god. That seems to be at play here as well. Let's look at dream number 14. "The dreamer goes into a chemist's shop with his father. Valuable things can be got there quite cheap, above all a special water. His father tells him about the country the water comes from. Afterwards, he crosses the Rubicon by train." End quote. So the fact that the dreamer is now directly dreaming the imagery of chemistry, going into a chemist's shop, and they sell a special water. So we might remember that the philosopher's stone was sometimes said to be, the fire within the water, or even said to be a liquid or a tincture of some kind. Or we might think of the fact that the prima materia is sometimes associated with water. Perhaps he's at the chemist's shop to secure the prima materia, the beginning of the great work. But the interesting fact that he's there with his father, and Jung writes about this, quote, "We could say that the father represents the country or soil from which that life sprang, but figuratively speaking, he is the informing spirit who initiates the dreamer into the meaning of life and explains its secrets according to the teachings of old. He is a transmitter of traditional wisdom." End quote. But further, that after this he goes and crosses the Rubicon by train. And what does crossing the Rubicon mean? For one, I mean, it's a river, it's a body of water, which is kind of interesting. But historically, crossing the Rubicon has the connotation of there is no turning back now. Because when Caesar crosses the Rubicon, that's a civil war, right? You've violated the sacred laws of Rome. You've broken the boundaries of Rome's temenos, right? Because no one is supposed to enter the city under arms. That's forbidden. And so the minute that Caesar did that, there was no turning back. It was succeed or perish, right? And so that can sort of indicate the course of integration of the self that the dreamer has embarked upon. He has no choice now but to continue or to perish. Let's look at the next one. This is Dream 22. Quote, "The dreamer is in an American hotel. He goes up in the lift to about the 3rd or 4th floor. He has to wait there with a lot of other people. A friend, an actual person, is also there and says that the dreamer should not have kept the dark, unknown woman waiting so long below, since he had put her in the dreamer's charge. The friend now gives him an unsealed note for the dark woman on which is written, 'Salvation does not come from refusing to take part or from running away. Nor does it come from just drifting. Salvation comes from complete surrender, with one's eyes always turned to the center. On the margin of the note, there is a drawing, a wheel or wreath with 8 spokes. Then a lift boy appears and says that the dreamer's room is on the 8th floor. He goes up in the lift, this time to the 7th or 8th floor. An unknown red-haired man standing there greets him in a friendly way. Then the scene changes. There is said to be a revolution in Switzerland. The military party is making propaganda for, quote, completely throttling the left. The objection that the left is weak enough anyway is met by the answer that this is just why it ought to be throttled completely. Soldiers in old-fashioned uniforms now appear, who all resemble the red-haired man. They load their guns with ramrods, stand in a circle, and prepare to shoot at the center. But in the end, they do not shoot and seem to march away. The dreamer wakes up in terror, end quote. So what do we notice about the floors and the lift the dreamer is going to, right? The 3rd or the 4th floor, the 7th or the 8th floor. Remember what we talked about last time, sort of Jungian numerology, the wavering of the mind between the 3rd and the 4th or the 7th and 8th. 3 or 4th stages, 7 or 8 transformations, which is it? I'm not going to reiterate those points about how that all works. You can go revisit that episode if you need a refresher on that. But it's incredible that that appears in this dream, right? That under no observation or direct input from Jung, the dreamer replicates that wavering between the 3rd and 4th and the 7th and 8th in this dream. And again, we have the anima appear again, the dark, unknown woman. The message on the note that he is supposed to give her is, almost seems to be an explicit statement of the unconscious, of how he has to sort of surrender to his unconscious self in order to continue the great work. And there's the wreath with 8 spokes on it, another sort of symbol, a circular symbol, a mandala symbol, with that balance of 8. And then when the dream shifts, that's when things get really interesting. Jung thinks that the red-haired man is a synonym for the man with the pointed beard, and thus for Mephisto or Mercurius, and that it's he who changes the scene. He changes himself into the soldiers, quote, representatives of uniformity, of collective opinion, which is naturally dead against tolerating anything unsuitable. For collective opinion, the numbers 3 and 7 are, on the highest authority, sacred, but 4 and 8 are the very devil, something inferior. Further down, quote, the left is to be, quote, completely throttled, meaning the unconscious and all the other sinister things that come from it. An antiquated view, no doubt, and one that uses antiquated methods, but even muzzle-loaders can hit the mark. For reasons unknown, i.e. not stated in the dream, the destructive attack on the center, to which, according to the advice in the note, one's eyes must always be turned, peters out, end quote. And I think that about does it for I think Jung sufficiently explained all we really can about that dream. Again, with a lot of these, we're trying to analyze the inner psychic life of somebody that we don't know, and we don't really know the details of his waking life, and we're sort of all looking at it in this context, this narrative interpretation of seeing it as the alchemical allegory for creating psychic wholeness, right? But there's always going to be a couple mysteries in here, but I think, Jung does the best possible job that he can with this, and even when everything is not entirely clear, again, part of why I wanted to go through this is that you just see these symbols and numerological relationships and things that they're unmistakable. Again, let's go to number 23, in fact. Quote, in the square space, the dreamer is sitting opposite the unknown woman whose portrait he's supposed to be drawing. What he draws, however, is not a face, but 3-leaved clovers on distorted crosses in 4 different colors: red, yellow, green, blue, end quote. And Jung writes, quote, in connection with this dream, the dreamer spontaneously drew a circle with quarters tinted in the above colors. It was a wheel with 8 spokes, and the middle was a 4-petaled blue flower. A great many drawings now followed at short intervals, all dealing with the curious structure of the center, and arising from the dreamer's need to discover a configuration that adequately expresses the nature of the center. The drawings are based partly on visual impressions, partly on intuitive perceptions, and partly on dreams, end quote. And so we have that wavering between 3 and 4 again, right? They're 3-leaved clovers on distorted crosses. So a cross is 4, right? 4 points to the cross, whereas the clovers have 3 leaves. And then he draws 4 of them when he's supposed to be drawing the face of the unknown woman, of the anima. And Jung writes about this, quote, "The present dream from which the above-mentioned drawings originated shows no signs of the left having been in any way throttled. On the contrary, the dreamer finds himself once more in the temenos, facing the unknown woman, who personifies the 4th or inferior function. His drawing of the wheel with the 4-petaled blue flower in the middle was anticipated by the dream. What the dream represents in personified form, the dreamer reproduces as an abstract ideogram," end quote. I think that's fairly straightforward. And I want to get to some of the more profound dreams at the end, but just to kind of go through without analyzing them in much detail, because I think it's not really necessary at this point. I mean, in Dream 26, he hears a voice that says, "It will begin," and when the dreamer asks, "What will begin?" the voice says, "The circulation can begin." And then he sees a shooting star and a curious leftward curve. He has another dream standing in a circle with a green tree in the middle, in which a fierce battle is raging between savages who do not see the tree. I mean, very obvious as well. That's sort of, again, the inferior functions, the drives, whatever might be, the shadow self, the drives that are at war with each other, failing to recognize the new center. Or there's another visual impression where there's a circle and within it steps lead up to a basin with a fountain inside. There's another dream where the dreamer's sitting at a round table with the dark unknown woman. So we just keep seeing these repeated themes becoming sort of just reiterated in different forms, with the unconscious irrigating the consciousness, trying to get the waking life to get the message. In Dream 45, we have a parade ground with troops, so we have that imagery appearing again. They are not equipping themselves for war, but form an 8-rayed star rotating to the left. The next dream, the dreamer is imprisoned in a square enclosure. Lions and a wicked sorceress appear. Another dream shortly after that, he sees a starry figure rotating. At the cardinal points of the circle, there are pictures representing the seasons. So again, that's another mandala image, and one that isn't just static. It's not just a still circle, but one which rotates, which moves, which shows the circumambulation process. One of the dreams that I think is very explanatory is when we get to number 50, quote, "An unknown man gives the dreamer a precious stone, but he is attacked by a gang of Apaches. He runs away and is able to escape. The unknown woman tells him afterwards that it will not always be so. Sometime he will have to stand his ground and not run away," end quote. So an unknown man has given the dreamer a precious stone, right? Again, the lapis symbolism, unmistakable here. He's attacked by a gang of Apaches. There's his shadow self, and the unknown woman, the anima, counsels him that he will eventually have to stand his ground. He can't keep running away from this. And then in Dream 52, quote, "A rectangular dance hall. Everyone is going round the periphery to the left. Suddenly the order is heard, to the colonels. But the dreamer first has to go into the adjoining room to crack some nuts. Then the people climb down rope ladders to the water," end quote. Jung's comment is, quote, "The time has come to press on to the kernel or core of the matter, but the dreamer still has a few hard nuts to crack in the little rectangle, the adjoining room, i.e. in one of the 4 functions. Meanwhile, the process goes on and descends to the water," end quote. And they do it by rope ladder, right? So again, the ladder imagery of ascending and descending to the water, clear imagery of the unconsciousness. But the rectangular dance hall, so, it's not just the circle. Remember, there's sort of like the imagery of squaring the circle, which was often used among the alchemists, being within a square space or within a circular space. In either case, well, the square has 4 sides, so it's representative of a quaternity, right? And the circle is the mandala, the magic circle, the temenos. Often these 2 shapes are sort of like overlaid on top of one another. So think of the the perfectly symmetrical garden at the bottom of the sea with the circular fountain in the center of it, right? Often that's what you're going to see. And these kinds of images of this sort of like central place that's symmetrical, that's the squared circle, sort of begin to build and build on one another as the dreamer continues to work towards whatever it is he's trying to integrate, until we get at the end of the sequence these dreams with just this incredible detail to them. And we're just going to look at two more, but this is number 54, quote, "I come to a strange solemn house, the house of the gathering. Many candles are burning in the background, arranged in a peculiar pattern with 4 points running upward. Outside at the door of the house, an old man is posted. People are going in. They say nothing and stand motionless in order to collect themselves inwardly. The man at the door says of the visitors to the house, when they come out again, they are cleansed. I go into the house myself and find I can concentrate perfectly. Then a voice says, what you are doing is dangerous. Religion is not a tax to be paid, so that you can rid yourself of the woman's image, for this image cannot be got rid of. Woe unto them who use religion as a substitute for another side of the soul's life. They are in error and will be accursed. Religion is no substitute. It is to be added to the other activities of the soul as the ultimate completion. Out of the fullness of life shall you bring forth your religion. Only then shall you be blessed. While the last sentence is being spoken in ringing tones, I hear distant music, simple chords on an organ. Something about it reminds me of Wagner's fire music. As I leave the house, I see a burning mountain, and I feel, quote, the fire that is not put out is a holy fire, end quote. And that's Shaw, St. Joan, that he's quoting in his dream. Jung's comment, quote, the house probably corresponds to the square, which is a gathering place. The 4 shining points in the background again indicate the quaternity. The remark about cleansing refers to the transformative function of the taboo area. The production of wholeness, which is prevented by the tax evasion, naturally requires the image of the woman, since as anima she represents the 4th, quote, inferior function, feminine because contaminated with the unconscious. In what sense the tax is to be paid depends on the nature of the inferior function and its auxiliary, and also on the attitude type. The payment can either be concrete or symbolic, but the conscious mind is not qualified to decide which form is valid. The dreamer's view that religion may not be a substitute for another side of the soul's life will certainly strike many people as a radical innovation. According to it, religion is equated with wholeness. It even appears as the expression of the integration of the self and the fullness of life. End quote. Further down, the theme of the fire mountain is to be met with the book of Enoch. Enoch sees the 7 stars chained like great mountains and burning with fire at the angel's place of punishment. Originally, the 7 stars were the 7 great Babylonian gods, but at the time of Enoch's revelation, they had become the 7 archons, rulers of this world, fallen angels condemned to punishment. End quote. So once again, we're getting these dreams with really stunning detail and really detailed messages from the unconscious to the conscious life. But the house of the gathering, that square space, right? That it's a place where it seems that all of his psychic functions are allowed to gather. It's the center of his psychic world, right? And you can enter and become cleansed. And so it's like the ego consciousness is allowing itself to become one of many functions, understanding that religion, the consciously articulated moral code and traditions and so on and so forth, no matter how much you tithe or kowtow or attempt to conform yourself to that, you'll never rid yourself of the image of the dark unknown woman, the anima who's a part of you. This sort of, I think, hints at some of what the dreamer's problems in waking life might have been, but we'll leave that kind of speculation aside. Maybe just a refusal to integrate the feminine aspects of himself, or certain views on women or experiences on women that might have clashed with his religious beliefs. But the ego is allowing itself to enter the house of the gathering, this new center of the self with all the other functions. And then again, we have the numerological imagery of the number 4, and then the number 7 associated with the mountain of fire. Again, it's just the kind of dreams that I would I don't think I've ever had in my life, right, that are just so detailed and so laden with symbolism. And what this culminates in is the dreamer's great vision, as he calls it. A vision with just an incredible amount of symbolism. The vision of the world clock. This is number 59. Quote, "There is a vertical and a horizontal circle having a common center. This is the world clock. It is supported by the black bird. The vertical circle is a blue disk with a white border divided into 4 by 8, 32 partitions. A pointer rotates upon it. The horizontal circle consists of 4 colors. On it stand 4 little men with pendulums, and round about it is laid the ring that was once dark and is now golden, formerly carried by the children. The clock has 3 rhythms or pulses. The small pulse, the pointer on the blue vertical disc, advances by 1/32. The middle pulse, 1 complete revolution of the pointer. At the same time, the horizontal circle advances by 1/32. And the great pulse, 32 middle pulses are equal to 1 revolution of the golden ring." End quote. And Jung writes, "This remarkable vision made a deep and lasting impression on the dreamer, an impression of the most sublime harmony, as he himself put it." Skipping a bit further down, Jung says, quote, "It is a 3-dimensional mandala, a mandala in bodily form, signifying realization. Unfortunately, medical discretion prevents my giving the biographical details. It must suffice to say that this realization did actually take place. Whatever a man does in reality, he himself becomes." Just why the vision of this curious figure should produce an impression of the most sublime harmony is in one sense very difficult to understand, but it becomes comprehensible enough as soon as we consider the comparative historical material. It is difficult to feel our way into the matter because the meaning of the image is exceedingly obscure. If the meaning is impenetrable and the form and color take no account of aesthetic requirements, then neither our understanding nor our sense of beauty is satisfied, and we are at a loss to see why it should give rise to the impression of the most sublime harmony. We can only venture the hypothesis that disparate and incongruous elements have combined here in the most fortunate way, simultaneously producing an image which realizes the intentions of the unconscious in the highest degree. We must therefore assume that the image is a singularly happy expression for an otherwise unknowable psychic fact, which has so far only been able to manifest apparently disconnected aspects of the self." End quote. And Jung includes an image, like an old engraving from an alchemical text that shows a clock and a bird. And, throughout this entire dream study, I've only kind of mentioned it a couple times. He has all of these old illustrations and engravings that show how much of the same symbolism, the same imagery made its way into alchemical texts. And so it would seem to provide some sort of justification for Jung's position that alchemy is perhaps an expression of those dreamlike functions of the mind. But the way that the clock, and its different pulses are, we see that it's a symbol of the psychological wholeness and that it's 4 by 8, right? And then it produces these intervals of 30 seconds, right, of 4 times 8. And the fact that it's almost belies words, right? As Jung says, the imagery itself it's a very abstract idea. It's a very, has a lot to do with like numerical relationships and numerology. And it is not immediately obvious why this might coincide with a great personal revelation or reaching that moment of self-integration, but it does for the dreamer. Because it would seem to be that the clock is it's like the ultimate symbol of squaring the circle, of reaching that wholeness of a quaternity. And not only that, the quaternity it's represented here in the clock. And again, the golden ring, so much imagery and the dreams and visual impressions have involved circling, that circumambulation. And it's like that through that circling process, the dreamers finally squared the circle and found the philosophical gold and found the quaternity, the wholeness, and so on. And Jung says we have to take his word for it that, biographically speaking, this coincides with the work of psychic integration. That was his own personal philosophical stone, or magnum opus, that the dreamer completed here. So Jung's suggestion that the unconsciousness is pushing the self toward a new center, a new kind of wholeness, would seem to have been realized. And I think as far as Jung proving the case that this alchemical symbolism transcends the coded language, the symbols of the alchemists themselves, or the culturally bounded religious imagery of their time and place, I think this dream study does a fairly good job of that. Now, of course, one of the other disadvantages is that Jung cites only one dreamer's sequence of dreams. So the context, that gives us ground to stand on insofar as interpreting the individual dreams, right? We can interpret dreams only in a sequence, only in context, as he says at the beginning, because it's a bit fraught to interpret them individually. But the downside of that is that we only have a single subject, right? So while this proves that the alchemical imagery can spontaneously appear in the mind of this scientifically educated man from presumably Austria or Switzerland, it doesn't go very far in showing this to be like a true universal. There may be any number of reasons why this particular person was prone to dreaming in alchemical imagery that might not appear in other people. But that being said, if we accept the limitations of the study, at the very least, we can make the claim that this imagery, these symbols, even down to some specific details like the wavering between 3 and 4, wholeness found by moving to an incomplete trinity to a complete quaternity, the magic circle or the mandala, and then the various archetypes of the unconscious that are often portrayed in the alchemical texts, such as the nymphs and maenads or the wild man and Mercurius and so on and so forth. This all appears spontaneously out of the unconscious, right? At least in this one individual. And so presumably if it happens with this one individual, it could happen with others. And this might point to the fact that not that alchemy is baked into our psyche, but rather that alchemy drew on psychological projections that were already there in the psyche, in the collective unconscious. So the psyche is an alchemy, is really the claim being made. Not that alchemy is universally in every psyche. But if that is the case, then it means that we might have something to learn from alchemy about human psychology that might be relevant even today, as the unconscious continues to send forth these types of images and ideas and characters. So studying the alchemical texts could be a way of deciphering those communiques. That was Jung's contention. And in spite of the extreme esotericism involved in studying alchemy, the incredible time commitment in learning all these stages and correspondence and the meanings of these very obscure images and phrases, I personally feel I've been enriched by learning about it. And aside from the psychological insight, there's just a deep cultural insight here. If Jung is right that the waking mind of Europe was stuck in Christian dogma, but the dreaming mind, the mind seeking hidden or mysterious knowledge, unknown to the many, was absorbed in alchemy, right? Then what we have here is a sort of it's like a cultural undercurrent, a cultural underground that has, in ways not immediately apparent, sort of secretly influenced the surface world of our civilization, so to speak, in countless ways that we're not aware of. But it's there. And that for me is the real treasure, the real opus, the real stone to be gained, the treasure hard to attain in studying alchemy today, the discovery of insights about the human mind and about our culture. Insights that are usually dismissed because, as we mentioned at the beginning, alchemy isn't that a bunch of pseudoscience about turning lead into gold. Hopefully, after these episodes, all of us can leave that kind of hand-waving, dismissive silliness aside and realize that there is, to use a double entendre here, not ordinary gold, but philosophical gold to be found in the study of alchemy. And with that, we will conclude. That is all for this week. Thank you for joining me. I hope you've all found this as fascinating as I find it. May you all transform yourselves from dead stones into living philosophical stones. Cheers. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.